So, hello everyone. Wherever you're listening, I was going to say good morning, good evening, and good afternoon there to the education landscape, looking forward and reflecting back. And it's an absolute privilege to have Al Kingsley here with me today. Hi, Al, you all right?
I'm very well. Lovely to see you. Good to have a chat.
Yes, yeah, and I know none of this will be in the recording, but we had some technical issues. I'm so glad we've got them sorted and can actually make this conversation happen. Now, in terms of the whole layout and everything, I'll be the first to just profess that I'm not the greatest interviewer, if I'm honest. So any feedback you can give me afterwards, I'd be really appreciative of it. Now, I did write a little bio for you just to introduce you. And I'll be honest, as I was typing it, I was getting tired because of the amount of work that you do. So I'm going to include a couple of key bits, but then feel free to add to that as well. So without further ado, this is my bio. I'm going to go into reading mode now. So if I look a bit robotic, please, I do apologize. Al has over 30 years experience in EdTech and 20 years experience as a school trustee and governor. He is the group managing director of NetSupport Limited, an internationally acclaimed EdTech vendor, and has lived and worked in both the UK and US. He is the chair of 2 academy trusts and chair of an alternative provision academy. Last month, Al became the executive council member of the British Educational Suppliers Association. And in 2021, Al wrote his first book, My Secret EdTech Diary, looking at educational technology through a wider lens. And I'm super chuffed to say that I've read the book and I am definitely a massive fan. So if I reference it few too many times in here, I apologize. Al, I know for a fact that I missed out a couple of things there, and I'm sure one of the first questions you always get asked is, when do you sleep? When does sleep occur for Al Kingsley?
Yeah, well, I think that'll come at the end of my days. I think I always slightly lightheartedly say I think I'm really blessed that actually I enjoy what I do. And somehow if you enjoy what you do, it doesn't really feel like it's that difficult. I am lucky, having spent, as you alluded to, many years in the US, or a few years, establishing our business over there. I always used to be a bit of an early bird so that I could manage and support the UK team before the US office sprung into life. And when I came back to the UK, I just kind of carried on that trend. So I've kind of got myself into a routine, really.
Fantastic. And I think, I've heard you mention it a couple of times, you love what you do. And I think that really speaks to me in the book itself, just the way that it's written, the tone and the passion towards education and education technology. It really comes through the pages. So on behalf of the education community, I have to thank you for having someone like you with the amount of energy and experience on our side, to be honest, which is absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
So to go into a number of the questions, obviously, we've already alluded to the fact that you've got so many years of experience, not only in EdTech, but in education itself. And it was only this year that the book came out. So why did you feel that now was the right time to write the book and publish the book?
I guess in a way, there's never a right time, is there? Because, the landscape's always moving. And if you're practicing what I always preach, reflective practice, as soon as you do something, there's a risk that, you want to do it again a year later or 2 years later. But I think there's a very special moment now in many regards, which is for the first time, many of us have been talking about the role that EdTech can play to support, fantastic teaching and learning, but also the broader life in schools. And for the first time, that kind of, we must get round to that narrative. It's suddenly gone up the agenda to being something that we've had to do. And miraculously, even though we've had huge pressure and capacity, schools have done it. And in many cases have done it really, really well. And so I think now's a great time to move from the let's talk in the theoretical to actually let's make sure that we reflect on the lessons learned, the things that we've done really well over the last 18 months. And of course, the things we've tried and not done so well at, but actually those are positive lessons. You always learn from your mistakes. That's certainly my approach to life. So it seemed a really important point to make sure that we firstly make EdTech accessible to everybody. And secondly, I think many of us involved in education really want to make sure that the strides we've taken in the last 18 months aren't lost. We don't slip back to the way before, and we miss that opportunity to capitalize on whether it's the additional amount of tech that's in our schools to actually some of the skills we've acquired, that muscle memory of how we have confidence using certain solutions in our schools.
Fantastic. And it is a case of keeping that momentum going and keeping that energy going. And I think that the book is a fantastic place to start as well. Just to give you a bit of an idea and an insight into why I really enjoyed the book as well. I looked at it in so many different forms and fashions. It was a trip down memory lane. There was elements of nostalgia there that I thought about, okay, this is tech that I remember being the new buzz tech in the day. And then obviously everything that's gone through in the pandemic and the advice and support you give in terms of that. But on a personal note as well, as someone who is beginning his foray into the EdTech sphere, so to speak, with the Time platform, for me, as a potential vendor or an edupreneur, it was so useful. And I have to be honest, it's something that I wish I'd read a couple of months or a year beforehand. But it was so nice. Again, you've used that word reflection and getting that chance to reflect on what's worked well and what you can develop as well. And as educational practitioners, as reflective practitioners, I know teachers are the ones that will be the first to say, okay, tech isn't that daunting. Let's try and explore this the best way that we can do. And it's good that we've got the book to support in that regard.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I was really conscious of is that whenever we mention the EdTech word, for every person who perks up and says, oh, this will be interesting, there's another where you can see the color drain from their face and that fear sets in of, oh, that's the realm of the techies, not so sure about that. And so my attempt, and I'm glad that you enjoyed reading it, was just to make it accessible to everybody, because EdTech is just a tool we use in the classroom. We don't have paintbrushes in the realms of just certain subset of teachers and educators. And I think the most effective technology is the stuff you don't think about. You just use it. It does what you expect it to do, and it underpins and facilitates all the fun, creative stuff that happens. So it absolutely is not a technical guide. It's very much more of, let's make this a conversation everybody can join into.
100%, definitely. And I think you reference that so many times, in the sense that behind all of the technology that's used, it's only as good as the educational practitioner using it. And that's what I love as well, seeing professionals, teachers look at technology in a certain way, realizing it's not that scary, and then thinking, hang on, how can I use this? How can I explore it a little bit further? And that's when you get that real impact, which is just really nice to see, to be honest. Now, a bit of a challenging question for my next one. If you were going to summarize and explain what's happened to the sector over the past 2 years, how would you summarize everything that's happened in your experience? Because obviously you've got a wealth of experience on both sides, whether that's the technology side or your role as a chair as well. I'm sure there's certain avenues in certain areas you've looked at, but what would be the key things, do you think?
I think there's, we could reflect probably from both sides of the EdTech sphere. So we can take from an education perspective. I think what we've learned, well, we've had one big catalyst, which is we've been given an opportunity to take risks. And by take risks, I mean try stuff. Actually go from the, well, it's not a priority, or maybe next year we'll talk about it, or we can't afford it, to actually try things. And trying things is the only way we do two things, either prove a yes or a no, but more importantly, that's how we innovate. And so I think the first thing is we've had this catalyst to learn loads. We've all been, as I like to refer to myself, edu sponges, trying new things and figuring out what does and doesn't work. And I think that's been the key. The second thing we've learned is, never mind the hardware, never mind the software. If you don't put sufficient CPD in, if you don't build staff confidence, if you don't give children confidence to use the tools, and never mind this idea that they're digital natives, just because you're confident on an Xbox doesn't mean that you can use the curriculum software that your school selected. If we actually recognize that we need like 3 strands, the technology, the software, and the CPD, in order to have successful delivery of technology, that gives us a very simplistic baseline in terms of how we can start to move the building blocks forward. And that will feed into then shaping a digital strategy. But we've also had a flip lesson for the EdTech sector, for all those individuals and organizations creating tools. Because what we've also learned is, it's not about who's got the most bells and whistles or who's got the most sophisticated solution. It's about accessibility and ease of use. The best solutions are the ones that schools can both adapt and adopt quickly, and actually are reliable. They do what they say on the tin. So we've also learned that the best way to achieve that is through co-production. And so those products that are developed with educators or by educators are the ones that have been the easiest to actually measure and have an impact. And that impact word has kind of filtered through, because everywhere we look now, when we talk about EdTech, the natural narrative is, show me the evidence. Tell me why your product's as good as you say it is. How can you actually prove it? And of course, different products fall in different categories. So some, it's a pedagogical assessment on how that's going to improve a child's confidence or uptake in their mathematics skills or their science skills. For others, it's about the evidence about how it can save time or foster better collaboration and communication. For some, it will be about supporting well-being. And for some, it will be about how that resource helps develop teachers' skills in all sorts of facets, very much like time, the kind of the resources for their own professional development. And again, I think those are the things that we've kind of recognized now, that it's changed the landscape, I think, for a better in many regards, but it means everybody's got to up their game. We can't just assume that if your product comes under the category of EdTech, that means it gets a big tick and it's everybody's interest. It's quite the opposite. There's so many solutions out there. You've got to stand out from the crowd by actually backing up what you're talking about.
100%. And you've referenced so many things there that I remember reading about in your book as well and reflecting on as well. The importance of impact, the evidence, as you referenced. And I wanted to touch on co-production in a moment as well. Before I do, though, after reading the book and the posts on social media, I love your posts on social media, to be honest. They really tend to be positive, funny, like the one today, which I thought was brilliant. For anyone who's not following, I'll definitely do. Because you'll get that good mix of advice and humor, which I think is sorely needed. But the vibe that I really get from you is that it's always very positive, but you've got a pragmatic mindset as well. And with that in mind, when looking forward, what do you think what are going to be the key trends and challenges for the sector? I think we focused on the trends a little bit. What are your concerns? What do you think are the challenges within the sector that we'll have?
I think there's a number of challenges. I mean, if we take hopefully the pragmatic view, failures are just stepping stones to success. That's a phrase I like to use. And I think what we have to recognize is when things don't go right, that shouldn't be the end of a journey. It should be a chance to actually reflect and look at how we can adapt and divert our journey. So I think the first challenge is some things have worked really well. We've got more technology in our schools. There's a real natural persuasion right now for many schools to slip back into the way that they delivered teaching and learning pre-pandemic. And to be fair, it's not really that much of a surprise, and in many regards it's justified, because we've got so many pressures on educators right now and school leaders that naturally you do what comes easiest to get through the day, to get through the period. But I think equally we've got to recognize there's an opportunity. The way that our learners engage and interact is not something that's going to stand still for the next 50 years. Things are constantly changing. We engage with our exams now with a pencil or a pen and paper, and we go to university and we do it on a keyboard. And at some point we're going to recognize that will change in schools, but maybe it won't be a keyboard. It'll be our voice, and we'll be talking to it the same way as we would to ask for the next music track to be played on our home music system. There's lots of different things we could look at. We need to kind of embrace the fact that some things will work well and some won't. That the technology being used for parent conferences, parents' evenings, loads of educators have seen that's been a real value in terms of keeping the meetings on task, allowing staff to go home before them. Parents get a more personalized experience. Instead of our staff coming in the Easter holidays for revision classes, maybe they'll do them online and they'll record them as exemplars so the kids that can't engage can. There's lots of small wins that I think we have to look at. So that first challenge is absolutely going to be how do we make sure we keep the confidence levels up? Because if we're not confident in solutions, gradually they'll cease to exist, or stop using them as effectively. And then I think, we kind of look beyond that, which is how do we put in plan realistic digital strategies or digital visions, or whatever term we want to use, which is we can't just blindly go with technology and say, let's keep adding stuff because it's shiny, it looks cool, or maybe it'll help. We've got to have a plan of what we're trying to achieve and how. Because with a plan, you can prioritize. And if you can prioritize and plan things, you've got a chance of actually putting some realistic measures in place. And I think measurements is the interesting one. We're all focused in education that our measurements are about outcomes. And that's not a bad measure in some regards, but that's courtesy of Ofsted or whoever, that we know that we're always going to be assessed on impact on teaching and learning. But think about the last 18 months. If we introduced a new bit of technology tomorrow that actually reduce teacher workload or save teaching time, wouldn't well-being and that measure be something that would be important for us as school leaders in our school? If it freed up their time, wouldn't that mean that time could be used in the order of the day, engaging with our learners in the classroom more effectively or for longer? If we did something that allowed our school or our multi-academy trust to operate more efficiently and save money through economies of scale, well, That's not going to impact directly on our outcomes this year, but it might free up cash that we can use to invest in other things that longer term will have an impact in the experiences our child's had. And I'd argue, well, there's some extra money for some more experiential activities for our learners, the things they've sorely missed over the last 18 months. Or maybe it'll be about tools that we use to keep our learners safer. And again, they don't necessarily fall into the Ofsted assessment of are you good or outstanding, but actually these things often feed in bigger picture. So what I'm kind of really delivering towards is focusing on schools recognizing that there are lots of potential wins with how we've started to embrace the use of technology, and let's not try and squeeze them into one single measure. The most important one, Bassett, I think, which we've learned over the last 18 months, and I'm not wishing to be confrontational or upset any senior leaders, is when it comes to planning our digital strategy. Sometimes the SLT of our school aren't the best people to be doing it. They absolutely are the ones to shape our strategic ambitions, but actually, by the nature of experience and time spent working their way through the ranks, it doesn't automatically mean they're the ones with the best reference point about how technology has been effectively used in teaching and learning in their lessons. And so actually it takes a strength of leadership to say, yes, we'll set a vision, but I'm actually got the confidence to empower people down through the teaching ranks and the IT teams and the TAs to get other voices to help shape where we can actually stimulate and change the way that we use technology, where it can innovate. We want to get the voice of our learners, of course, about the ways that different technology can actually encourage and get them more engaged. And we've seen all sorts of ways that technology can help gamify the way that different content is delivered. People looked at Minecraft a few years ago and said, well, it's a game, play at home. And then we suddenly thought, but hang on, don't we learn about managing resources and space and dimensions and planning and all these other things? And actually, you start to look and think, actually, we just need to start looking at things through a different lens.
100%. And I think, yeah, exactly as you said, SLT, for all the will in the world, they may not be the best person, the person best equipped for that. It's the people on the chalk face seeing it, seeing that technology and seeing that light bulb moment. I'm in such a privileged position to work in so many different schools, use lots of different pieces of technology. And when you see that real impact that it has on that student, difficult to measure in that moment, but you see that it's had that impact on the student, and it'll be the teachers that see that and acknowledge that and recognize it. And it's really important that that is fed back as well. But absolutely fantastic. I could talk to you about that specific topic for a good while, but you've touched on so many of the key areas that I'd like to focus on as well. Even as a business owner as well, leveraging small elements of technology have supported me and my business in ways that I probably wouldn't have thought about. But now that we've had a chance to experience different pieces of technology, hopefully that will continue. Now, moving forward, in your book, you mention the importance of flexible and the feeling of blended learning, obviously over these last 18 months. That I don't think is going anywhere. It's already existing in further education and higher education, and hopefully we're going to see elements of it within the classroom. But would you feel that flexible and blended learning form a part of your rationale behind Classroom.Cloud?
To a point, yes. I mean, the first thing I think we think of is, well, let's assume there isn't a pandemic anymore, and let's think everything else stays standard. Naturally, our default position will be we want teachers and students in the same space and classroom engaging and learning. But actually, the blended element says, well, actually, there are some things where that could be. I use the example of those revision classes where technology could still foster and deliver that. There could be a reason why some learners can't be in class, and instead of that being a lost opportunity for learning, it could be recorded in some shape or form so they can still access it. But I think if we come back to that real nub of technology, do we think the best approach is to fill our school with loads of different solutions, or can we be smarter and actually think where one solution can serve multiple purposes? So our logic was, having had 30 years of developing solutions for the desktop and to work in the school setting, couldn't we take the best bits and deliver something that was cloud-based that would still deliver exactly that within the classroom, but then we could move the physical constraints and say, but it also works if the children aren't in class or the teacher isn't in class. And then for want of a better term, we've just invested in our insurance policy, because we've got to learn one product. That's half the CPD for the staff, build confidence, and for the students. And now if there is another scenario where we've got children that are dispersed away from the physical space, we don't have to change tools. was still there. And then the other part was, well, actually, if we're putting our learners online, we've also got to put that wraparound of care, whether we're thinking about our Kinglsey obligations or broader, just that digital citizenship of supporting our children. So the idea with Classroom Cloud was to take our 30 years experience of instructional tech and our 20 years worth of online safety and keyword monitoring technology and put the best bits together in a single solution. And by the way, learn a few lessons about less is more, make it easy, make it simple to actually implement and to manage. And that's part of that reflective process, which is, when you've been in the business a long time, it'd be really easy to keep making the argument that what you've already made and developed over the years is perfect. And no, it doesn't need any change. But actually, you've got to be honest and say, well, the landscape's changed now. The criteria has shifted, not massively, but it's nudged away slightly. And I think as vendors, you have to be big enough to say, you know what, we need to go away and adapt and revise that. It needs to be fit for 2022, and we can't take the 2019 model anymore because there's sufficient differences that it's just not going to be perfect. And with my passion in education and with the amazing team we've got at NetSupport, why wouldn't we try and do something that's even better?
Absolutely. And you touched on digital citizenship there as well, and bringing the control and the experiences back to the young person. And I noticed that was a feature on part of Classroom.Cloud as well. If there's something that they feel is cause for concern, then the onus is on them to then send a message back. And I think that creating digital citizens and digitally literate students and young people is such an important thing to do as well. I mean,
absolutely key. Yeah.
As a parent of a 7-year-old, I had to check myself then. She is 7. I'm going to get told off for not knowing her age then. But it always makes me a little bit concerned, this digital world that we live in, and how she's going to cope with it. And I hear similar conversations and messages with other parents as well. But I also believe that with resources such as yourself and just the whole idea around this digital world that we live in, I'm hoping that she'll have a element of digital resilience that the generations before haven't had, because they've been born with it. We're learning to adapt, and like you said, those small nudges to try and make it that little bit better. That might not be in its technical capacity, but it might be in morally it's a better working system as well. And that's what really excites me about education and technology working together in that regard.
I think there's lots of lessons we learn. And much as I'm obviously, we focus and we're advocates of putting those wrappers of care around to keep our learners safe online, I'd love to not have to. I think the digital citizenship, empowering our youngsters to make informed decisions, to consider the risks of where their digital footprint is, the way they conduct themselves online. And after the last couple of years, whether it's from a health or a political perspective and landscape, actually challenging the validity of information, what information they're consuming, giving them the skills to actually research and challenge themselves. In the longer term, that's got to be the more appropriate pathway. And you talked earlier, Bassett, about the skills that and the technology that you've adopted within your workplace for a business that can help improve. Well, the same challenge applies in schools now, which is we've got to think there is a gap between what our learners are being taught in terms of skills now and what the workplace needs. And as we think to our learners who might hit the workplace in 8-10 years from now, the skills they need to acquire will be very different to the current curriculum platform, so to speak. So I think the more we're utilizing technology and also providing the skills to utilize it safely now, the more likely we are to have the future workforce ready to move into the workplace and actually have an impact.
100%. Yeah, definitely. And not to go into it in too much depth, because we really will be here forever, but touching on the idea of metacognition and collaboration and learning to learn and develop those skills through trial and error. I think tech is a fantastic place to start in that regard as well, to see kids kind of evolve when they start to use a piece of software or a piece of kit. So it is really, really exciting times. With that in mind, actually, because obviously Classroom Cloud would have looked a certain way this time last year or 2 years ago. And then since its launch, how do you feel it's evolved because of this rapidly changing landscape? I think the term you use within the book is agile, making sure that you're able to sort of move and adapt in certain ways. Would you say Classroom.Cloud has gone through something like that?
Yeah, well, I certainly wouldn't call myself agile, so Classroom Cloud is definitely a better focal point for that conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think like all things, as a developer, you take a certain path where you want to do loads of things and you want them to be robust, and you want to make sure that you've worked with others to make sure it's fit for purpose. And again, if we think about the new model, we've got a changing landscape. What we want to do is have a framework that allows us to put proven technology into the hands of educators and children. But we also want a framework that allows us to adapt quickly. And that adapting really comes from, particularly for us as a business, we're heavily invested in education. Many will know we're involved in all aspects, from supporting different educators at trade shows to the magazines we do, the radio station, all sorts of bits and pieces. And I always say it's a two-way street. We provide a voice for others in the sector, but if we're doing our job right, we're always listening, we're always learning, we're always picking up where those challenges and pinch points are. And if you are mindful and you do have the confidence of your convictions to say, you know what, we got that bit wrong, we're going to change that, then actually there's always an opportunity, if you structure it right, to keep evolving the solution quickly to meet the challenges that schools are facing. And that ties in with working with educators, that co-production narrative, but it's all part of having a mindset of not taking the kind of the classic perception of a vendor creates a product first and then tells the customer why they need it. We need to do it the right way around.
Absolutely. And touching on the idea of co-production as well, and I referenced at the start in terms of creating the Time platform, my first venture into this EdTech world. I was going through the mindset of that I was a teacher. Katie, who I work with, is a teacher as well. We'd like to think that we know what teachers want right now. But it's been nice for me as I've started to let people know about Time. I've had so many insights and ideas that have come through. And it's something that really interests me, this idea of co-production. For those who are unsure what co-production is, would you mind just quickly explaining what co-production is? And in your opinion, how important it is with regard to an EdTech solution?
Yeah, I mean, I can simplify the process down to, I can either go away in a cave with my team, create something new, announce it with a fanfare, and then wait for the feedback. And once I've had the feedback, I can quickly head back into my cave to fix all the issues. Or I can start off by inviting all of the ultimate customers I'm aiming for to come and meet me for a conversation. And we can talk about what they need and why they need it and which bits are important. And then during the development process, we can keep checking in with them to say, is that what you meant? Is that how you expected it? So then when the fanfare goes at the end, and it might take us slightly longer to do that process, but when we actually release it at the end, we've got something that everybody understands and it's relevant to the current setting, and it's likely to be much more successful because it fits people's needs. And that sounds really, really simple, but there are so many people. Sometimes it's well, I've spoken to people, I've got an idea, now I'm heading off into the cave. And actually the landscape's moving so fast, you can't disappear away for 3 months and expect that there won't be nuances or changes. And I think it's a natural thing. When you've been through the process yourself, Bassett, when you're creating something, it becomes quite a personal thing and you're very proud of what you're doing. And so anybody that critiques it, it's very easy to get thin skin and kind of like, oh, that's a bit tough. This is my baby. But in reality, that's how products are shaped and evolved. Every new car on the road goes through feedback from magazines and motoring shows, and the next version that comes out has got those subtle tweaks. I think with effective co-production, the vendor benefits from not having to do those revisions because you get it right first time, or certainly close to right. And there's also an opportunity for the schools, the educators that get involved, to actually shape a solution that they need that currently isn't available, and actually be part of that process. So it can be a win-win. Naturally, they end up with a solution that's exactly what they need. There's an opportunity for them to learn about how products are developed. And actually, one of those other lessons we've learned is, vendors that are successful don't just say, hi, here's a product, goodbye. It's about you start relationships, hopefully long-term relationships where you're working with the school to make sure they're always happy with your product, but you're also keeping that feedback loop. Again, we just take the ideas that make perfect sense in the classroom and say, well, why shouldn't that be any difference between the vendor and the teacher and the educators? You keep telling us how it's working well, but also keep telling us how it's not. We'll keep fine-tuning it and sending it back to you. And that's the way that we're both in a position where it's working for all stakeholders.
Absolutely. And you've already touched on it, the benefit to the school. Obviously, the end product is going to be better for the school because they've been part of the production. But also, I think that experience of having that conversation with someone outside of the classroom, but still part of the education sphere. That's so useful. One of the areas of time that really excites me is our section called Time to Hustle. And it is all of those skills that teachers can develop by forming communications and relationships with people just on the precipice of education. And I think to be involved in a co-production element as well, to see what it's like to actually create a product, to be part of that task force that is trying to improve that product. You could then bring that back into the classroom in the context of when you're talking about effective planning with your students. And the next time a child says, oh, why are we putting so much effort into planning? You've got a real life example there. And I think that that's something that is a massive benefit when it comes to co-production for the school as well, not only the end product.
I agree. I think it's a really important point, but I think there's also the second strand, which is if you've co-produced and worked with a vendor, you also get to understand the process, the development process, the challenges and the opportunities. And it also empowers you then as a school that when you deal with other vendors, you're much better informed with the challenge, the questions, the things you need to evaluate and assess before you make decisions on the technology you're going to build on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I didn't even think about that, but you're absolutely right. You'd probably scare some EdTech vendors in that situation, wouldn't you? How does he know so much? But that's really useful in terms of your school's journey. Now, we're very close to my final few questions. It's kind of like 2 and a bit, I'd say. So although the pandemic has led to a larger discussion about the value of EdTech, it can still be quite a daunting area for schools. And we've already alluded to the fact SLT may not necessarily be the person who leads the school in terms of that. But you've already shared throughout the talk some tips for schools. If you were going to summarize that, your top tips for schools on their EdTech journey, what do you think they would be?
As part of a broader EdTech journey, the first thing is shape your strategy. Don't just look at what you're doing, but ask the questions why you're doing it and how you're going to measure it. Those are the key things. Then there's the less is more. Don't try and do too many things at once. That's likely to be a route to failure. So do a few things, get them embedded, measure them, and then reflect and then build to the next stage. Loads of CPD. If you think you've planned enough CPD, double it and do it again. And certainly if you're looking to introduce new technology, make sure that you're actually budgeting for that training, whether it's to provide the cover in the classroom for teachers. Don't assume they're going to just accommodate and assimilate that on their weekends, or to provide that kind of ongoing professional development. The other one is to identify the flag bearers in your school. Across your school, there will be some teachers who are hugely confident with technology and different types of tools. Signpost them. Make sure there's lots of places that those who are less confident can go to be the kind of the go-to people for advice, support, and nurture. And I think that often by spreading that makes people feel much more confident to try stuff because they know there's that kind of support infrastructure in place around it. And then I think the final thing is constantly checks and balances. Keep making sure you're getting all the voices included as part of that narrative. And don't be afraid to stop and change your digital strategy. It should be a living document. You will learn lessons, you will see new things, you will learn from peers, but whatever you do, make sure you can measure it internally and validate it with your peers externally. Make sure you've got those checks and balances.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Al, for all of your information and advice with regards to EdTech. I don't think there's anyone better equipped to give that advice. Now, to wrap up, these were 2 questions that I added, because obviously having read your book and seen the work that you've done and the journey of NetSupport, it is truly inspirational. Now, one thing that I'm really passionate about in terms of Siddiqui education is to emulate a working environment and essentially condensing it, turning the language into people speak, and then offering something of value to students. For me, it's almost that learning through stealth, but also that aha moment where they think, oh, okay, this is why we plan in school, because planning is such an important part of what we do. So to give you an idea, the main workshop that I do is something called Let's Pitch It. And that's a condensed version of students working in groups to pitch an idea for a television show, part of a wider national competition. But behind that, and all the exciting creativity that comes from it, the skills that those students are developing, collaboration, communication, presentation. And it's something that I always keep an eye out or an ear out for different professionals that are out there, different businesses that are out there, that if we could emulate this, wouldn't that be fantastic? Wouldn't that be a real fantastic experience for our students? So my question is, do you feel there is value in emulating the process you and your team follow in the conception and creation of a new EdTech solution? I'm hoping you don't just say no to that, because then that will just end my
I could be
sentence.
a brief end. I'm going to say yes, and actually, it's something I've done in schools as part of STEM, where I've been going in and talking about creating a new app. And if you think about some of the strands, it's the same concept as what we do. You start off by having to actually pull together the reasons of why you're going to create something. So it's about that kind of project planning, the business plan, the need for it. That often involves getting stakeholders together, and as students working on a project, whether it's going to research people, you've actually got to develop your oracy, your listening skills, and also to identify and succinctly summarize what you need to do. But then you've got to create a plan. So it's about prioritizing and the order of things that you need to do. You've then got to think, when you're developing an application, you've got to think not only about the design and layout, but you've got to think about the flow, the planning, the step by step, and how does that translate for a user? So that can be about signposting. It can also be about developing descriptions and explanations of how things work. Then you've got to think about, perhaps more from a coding perspective, think about the sort of simple scratch models of the steps to test a product. How would you go through the yes, no, the kind of the flow diagram to make sure that when you do something is the desired outcome? But then, of course, you move from having created an app, and we all know that youngsters will engage with the concept of apps because they're in their hands most of the day on their smartphones. I always take the view, which is, well, the best apps you may never have heard of. So how do you signpost it? How do you market it? How do you sell it? How do you actually summarize that elevator pitch in a few words or sentences what this product is and why you should try it? How do you prioritize visually what you signpost for it? How do you capture feedback to improve it? And so that life cycle, actually, if you sit with a class of children, I would argue it plays to those that are good with planning and finance, those that are good with listening and written skills, those that are good with design and creative skills, those that are good with the kind of the technical, the STEM skills in terms of how we can actually test and design something. There's something for everyone. And that ultimately reflects a typical technology company. It's not full of techies. There's a sales team, a marketing team, an admin team. You know, there's all the same roles there. But we can, exactly as you've try and do within the schools that you visit, Bassett, I think that kind of mindset of, well, you all have that concept of apps in your hand. If I gave you a green light, make your own app, what would you choose? Well, actually, it's really interesting to understand the thought process of what they would see. But when you say, why would people want it? And how would you make money from that? And how would you develop it? Then it really gets the cogs whirring. And I love it because I think it develops such a breadth of skills and thought processes.
Definitely, yeah. And I'm so glad you gave such a detailed answer there, because when I saw it and I thought that there's just so much to this and what the kids would get out of it. And every session that I do, I always finish with, although we focused on television or in your case, app development, every single skill that you've used today is a transferable skill that will benefit you so much moving forward when you leave school as well.
Absolutely.
So that was, I said there were 2 and a bit questions, but you answered 1 and a bit. And in the end, you sort of merged it all together. So that is my questions done. The education landscape, looking forward and reflecting back. Al, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Like I said, I'm a massive fan of yourself, the work that you do and your book, and to actually, for you to take the time to talk to me today has been absolutely fantastic. It's been an experience for me. So
My
thank
pleasure.
you.
No, I think we could probably have talked for 3 hours on the topics, but you know, well, it's all about, as it's shown today, the two of us chatting. You know, it's something that it's hard not to be passionate and enthusiastic about. And the message that I hope everyone just takes away is, now it's all about the opportunities that are ahead. Just embracing those opportunities and not wasting them.
100%. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Al.
My pleasure. Lovely to chat with you.